Finally, Evie snapped out from the strange, but pleasure-filled induced haze the delicious steak had trapped her in for that duration of time she was savoring it. Every single bite. She couldn't believe she allowed something so basic like food to take her on a flight into the clouds and made her forget about everything else. However, she comforted herself in the knowledge that though food was basic, but in no means was that piece of steak plain. It was far from plain. Finally, Evie snapped out from the strange, but pleasure-filled induced haze the delicious steak had trapped her in for that duration of time she was savoring it. Every single bite. She couldn't believe she allowed something so basic like food to take her on a flight into the clouds and made her forget about everything else. However, she comforted herself in the knowledge that though food was basic, but in no means was that piece of steak plain. It was far from plain. Also, she couldn't believe she had allowed herself to be fed like she was a child, and even allowed a prince to. Heavens, Evie! Stunned, Evie sat there, unmoving, while Gavriel's hand was stranded mid-air in his attempt to feed Evie another piece of steak. He moved the steak closer to her lips, causing Evie to flinch again. After which, she winced and quickly shut her eyes and took a deep breath, remembering how her newly minted husband had made that statement about not wanting his wife flinching away from him. With that deep steadying breath, she opened her eyes and bravely lifted her hand and held Gavriel's wrist so she could gently move the steak away without it seeming rude or discourteous. I can eat on my own, Your Highness." She blushed hard as she stammered those few words out, and when she finally realized she was still holding on to his wrist, a very strong yet tantalizing wrist, she might add, Evie yanked her hand back as if scalded before awkwardly averting her gaze away from him. She was 101% convinced that smoke was wafting off her red-hot ears as she felt his gaze on her face. What was she doing? Letting her guard down like that just because of a delicious steak? Was she so easily duped like a child? She never thought there would ever come a day that the temptation of a plate of food could easily win her over, hook, line, and sinker. But that was no ordinary plate of food. That steak was so heavenly it was almost sinful. She fell into her old habit of arguing with herself whenever something truly threw her off and completely flustered her thoroughly. However, she failed to realize that this only happens when she is totally comfortable with her surroundings. Back then, in her own home, it was understandable. But now she was in so-called enemy territories. While Evie was busy berating herself inwardly, Gavriel leaned back. His smile had long faded because the effect of the food was gone, and the little bunny was wary and on guard again. Too bad, he thought. He was enjoying feeding her and she was so cute when she was relaxed. He wanted to feed her like that every time they eat together. He wished he could continue feeding her more, but looking at her tensed shoulders made him silently back off. Without a word, he put the steak in his mouth, using the same fork he used to feed her. He didn't see her how she secretly threw a glance at him and was observing how he devoured the piece of steak that had just touched her lips. He also missed seeing how her face flamed red before she practically tore her eyes away from his face and refocused her gaze back on her own plate of food. After dinner, the couple had just left the dining hall when Gavriel spoke. "I would like to escort you around the castle, but the Emperor had requested for your presence in the Imperial Palace as soon as you woke up," he said, and as expected, Evie tensed up. She halted and looked at him with eyes wide opened. "You mean, now?" "Yes. Once you're ready, I'm taking you there." "But it's already dark." She bit the inside of her lower lip the moment she realized what she just said. How could she forget that to the vampires, the night was their daylight? "I will show you around the capital on our way there," he added. "You're asleep when we arrived, so you didn't see anything. I think you might like it." Evie opened her lips, intending to say something, but then shut it. Why was she struggling so hard just to think of an excuse that would sound valid enough? Honestly, she didn't need to try so hard to come up with any excuses, and could just straight up refuse the invitation. She was told to refuse, and she wanted to. But why couldn't she heartlessly say no, as was initially planned? She must refuse. But before she could open her lips again, Gabrielle was already talking to her maids to prepare her for her first appearance to the emperor. "Yes, your highness." The duo bowed and they excitedly approached Evie, eyes all sparkly. Wait. Gabrielle, Yes, he suddenly leaned closer on her. So close that Evie's mind was momentarily dumbfounded once again, with her husband's beauty, and she forgot what she was about to say. "Don't be scared, I am here to protect you. Now go and get ready, I'll wait downstairs." With that, the man left, leaving Evie silently berating herself again for being so weak, so defenseless against his beauty. "Oh please, Evie. You can't be so easily swayed like that. You can't. You can't." She was mentally shaking herself up, hoping to get a firmer grip on her own mind. As the maids brought her to her dressing room, Evie's mind was busy, thinking on how to deal with the temptations. She finally realized her greatest weakness, food and her husband's beauty. What should she do to raise her immunity against those two things? Food is an essential. How can she even say no? Evie had cloaked herself in her own world, thinking on how to solve this matter of hers that she didn't realize a long time already went by until Frey's voice reached her ears. "My lady? Are you okay?" She was yanked from her thoughts. "Yes?" The maid smiled at her. "We're done, my lady. You are looking so amazing." The maids were gushing with praises as she turned around to look at herself in the mirror. Her lips parted in surprise and awe. "I can't wait to see His Highness' reaction when he sees you." "Right," Gina piped in. "Now let's go, my lady, we can't let His Highness wait any longer." She urged gleefully, and Evie could only let them lead her out of the room. As she descended the grand staircase, Evie didn't know why her heart suddenly picked up the pace and started thudding loudly in her ears. Oh my, was she nervous? Why? Because of Gabrielle? Certainly not, right? This must be because she was going to meet the vampire emperor, humanity's ultimate enemy. She was not ready for this. Can she still back out of this? Certainly. She could back out when she wanted to. No one in this place could force her, not even Gabrielle. Evie's hands were clutching her gown so hard, her knuckles had turned white. She was too engrossed in her own predicament that she was jolted to awareness when a hand appeared in front of her. She realized she had reached the last steps, and when she took the hand and looked up dazedly, warning bells echoed inside her brain, being able to make sense of one word being screamed out: temptation. When Evie stepped out of the castle, she was already wearing the same black cloak that Gabrielle and his men were wearing. Her fiery dress and silver hair were now hidden under that thick and luxurious black cloak. While Gabrielle was speaking with a man who was also wearing the same black cloak, Evie was busy looking around. She turned and looked up. She knew it was dark, but she still couldn't help but admire how intricately beautiful the castle grounds were. Even in the dark, it was nonetheless obvious to see how massive the castle was, and the garden on the front yard was also vast. Her vivid thoughts could already picture the view of this place in broad daylight, and she must admit, this place was more beautiful and bigger than the infamous Lily Palace in Southern Empire. As she looked around, she thought that there must have been an error in thinking that the Emperor doesn't favor Gabrielle. He must be the Emperor's most beloved, and that's why he was given the most beautiful castle in the Empire. Wife, Gabrielle pulled her attention back to him as he walked closer to her. "Before we go, I'd like you to meet my men," he said, and 5 men stood in a line a few steps away before her. The hoods of their cloaks were down. Evie swallowed inaudibly at their overwhelming presence. 3 of them were just as tall as Gabrielle, but the other 2 were huge. Evie immediately remembered the huge and terrifying generals that used to accompany her father and the human emperors back in the Southern Empire. In fact, despite looking very relaxed, these 5 men were emitting a powerful aura that surpassed any human generals she had ever met. "Good evening, Your Highness, I am Samuel," said the biggest one with long brown hair. The first thing Evie noticed was the 2 big scars running from the middle of his forehead down to his left cheek. Trying her best not to stare at his scars due to her surprise, Evie's curiosity was sparked, because it was common knowledge that vampires heal themselves, and if they do get healed, they would never be left with scars. So how was it that this man had a scar? My name is Levi. Nice to meet you, my lady. The man with a jolly and friendly smile introduced himself next. His hair was brown as well, but he had a neat haircut that complemented his good looks. The first thing Evie noticed about him was his wide, friendly smile. I'm Luke, my lady. The third man was almost as tall as the huge Samuel. He looked aloof and expressionless. His tousled golden hair stood out, and Evie thought that his bright hair, though gorgeous, gave quite the exact opposite feel of not complementing his rather grey personality. I'm Zolan, my lady. The fourth man had a lively voice and an energetic smile. He had long blonde hair tied loosely behind him, and Evie's eyes immediately caught the lone golden earring in his ear. The last one had an innocent look. He was as tall as the others, but he looked young. His blue eyes and curly ash-gray hair were standing out. Reed, my lady, he said simply. And nice to meet you all. Evie was a little confused. What was the point of the introductions? Back in the human empires, this wasn't a norm. There was no need for a soldier to do any introduction like this unless the person they were serving asked for their names. Moreover, they definitely were not Evie's men. They were her husbands. Why were they introducing themselves to her? As though Gavriel had read her thoughts, the prince spoke. These 5 are my most trusted men, and they will be the ones guarding you whenever you venture outside our castle. So, it would be good if you memorized their names and faces. Evie creased her brows. They were guarding her? Why did she need to be guarded? Vampires cannot touch her and harm her, right? Before Evie could ask a question, another man approached them. The man doesn't feel intimidating, and he wasn't a towering tree like Gavriel and the other 5. He was wearing a kind smile, and his demeanor was almost human-like. He even had the same red hair as her 2 human maids. Yet clearly, he wasn't human. He was a vampire. A weak vampire, maybe? Meet my butler, Evelyn. He'll be your butler from now on as well. Don't hesitate to ask him if there is anything that you need. Gavriel said, and the butler smiled at her. I am pleased to meet you, your highness. I am Elias. Evie slightly nodded in acknowledgement of his greeting, and then Gavriel leaned in on her. Are you ready? He asked. We're not going to use a carriage as we are already late. I will be carrying you in my arms, wife. Oh, okay. Evie could only nod, and her approval made Gavriel's lips curved in a slight smile. Evie avoided looking at his face, so she didn't see how his gaze mischievously flickered. Without wasting a moment, he bent and lifted her so easily it was as if she was made of paper. Wrap your hands around my neck, wife. He said gently, and Evie obeyed. Her eyes carefully avoided looking at his glorious face. This was the solution she had thought of to avoid temptation. She shouldn't look at him longer than necessary. Her hands around his neck were so loose that she didn't even allow her hands to brush against his naked skin. However, the moment he leapt high above the ground, Evie's hands instinctively tightened around his neck. She was holding her breath, and her eyes were squeezed shut. This was the first time she experienced this. Were they flying? She had always wondered how flying would be like before, but now that she was experiencing it in the flesh, it actually felt scary. When she felt him land, Evie let out the breath she wasn't even aware she was holding in and prepared herself for another leap. But the man holding her didn't move again. Open your eyes, Evelyn. His deep voice echoed, and she slowly opened her eyes. I told you, I will show you the city while we are on the way there. But, you said we're already late. He smiled at her. The moonlight was so bright that night that she could see his otherworldly face clearly. Yes, but it's fine. No one can scold us for being late. She saw a naughty yet seemingly dangerous glint in his eyes. Why was he so carefree? Weren't they going to meet the Emperor? He is known to be the most powerful and dangerous being in this empire, and perhaps even in the entire continent. Now look, Evelyn. This is the view of the city at night. Evie could no longer resist. She slowly turned her head away from him and her lips parted at the sight that welcomed her. The vampire's imperial city was totally different from what she had imagined. It wasn't that creepy and lifeless place that she expected it to be. Lights were everywhere, the shadows of countless castles looming over certain sections of the city, and the streetlights made it look so magical, as though she was looking at the imperial fairy city. How could a place that's supposed to be hell-like end up looking so enchantingly picturesque? Do you like it? He asked, and Evie couldn't even stop herself from nodding. That's great. But we better move on. We can roam around on our way back. The next second, they were flying through the air again. Evie fought her instincts to shut her eyes, and when she looked down while they were in midair, she was surprised at the thrill and excitement she felt. She wasn't scared anymore, and she actually found herself enjoying it. Oh my, she was flying. She was so busy enjoying the incredible experience that she almost asked Gabrielle why had he stopped. Thankfully, she heard him speak before she could ask and embarrass herself. We're here, he said as he put Evie down. Evie turned and was speechless when she saw that they were already standing in front of a huge double door. This was obviously the palace's door. When she looked behind her, an even larger garden came into view. Oh my, just how big is this garden? Let me help you with your cloak, wife. Gabrielle pulled her attention back to him, and Evie could only stood still as Gabrielle carefully pulled down the hood of her cloak. While he removed the cloak from her, he whispered in her ear. Are you ready?